December 22nd, 1944, 0230 hours, temperature, minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in a frozen Belgian tree line, southwest of Bastogne, a 22-year-old sergeant from eastern Kentucky pressed himself flat against the snow and listened. He could hear them before he could see them, the low, rhythmic grinding of tank tracks on frozen ground, the particular mechanical moan of German armor moving at night, a sound unlike anything else in the world once you'd heard it, and he had heard it 3 times in the past 4 days. He did not run. Running would have been the end of everything. Instead, he reached for the handset of his SSCR 300 radio, the 12-pound instrument that connected him to the guns. Somewhere behind him, 5 miles back through the dark and the cold and the snow, the 155mm howitzers of the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion were waiting. 48 men, at instruments, phones, plotting boards, ready to execute whatever came through that handset in the next 60 seconds. He could not call them yet. Not until he could see. Not until he could give them something precise enough to use. Because precision was everything now. 3 German columns had probed the Bastogne perimeter in the past 24 hours. The 101st Airborne Division, 20,000 Americans, encircled in a Belgian market town, had perhaps 2 full days of artillery ammunition remaining. 2 days. The sergeant knew this. Every forward observer in the division knew this, which meant the next call he made could not be wasted. In the darkness ahead, he watched the shape of a Panzer IV materialize from the tree line. Then another. Then a third. His gloved hand found the handset. He began to whisper. This is the story of the men nobody made movies about. The men who crouched in frozen fields, 200 yards from German tanks, whispering coordinates into radios, and unleashed the full industrial fury of American firepower on a precise point in the dark. It is the story of a doctrine, revolutionary, improbable, trusted in the hands of young men from Kentucky and Nebraska and the south side of Chicago, that saved 20,000 lives in the coldest week of the 20th century. It is the story of the forward observer, and it begins in a quiet valley, a long way from Belgium. To understand why a 22-year-old sergeant from rural Kentucky was crouching in a Belgian forest in December 1944, whispering tank coordinates into a radio, you have to understand a decision he made 2 years earlier in a recruiting office in Louisville. He had stood in that office in October 1942, looking at 3 options: infantry, armor, artillery. He had chosen artillery. The recruiter told him it was one of the safer assignments. The guns stayed back from the front. The artillery positions were miles behind the fighting. You could serve your country without watching it happen 10 feet in front of your face. That recruiter was not entirely wrong about the guns. He was entirely wrong about what happened to the men who told the guns where to fire. His name was Corporal, later Sergeant, Earl Sherwood, and the specific details of his life before the war read like a census of American ordinariness. He grew up on a tobacco farm in Harlan County. He knew how to read weather and topography the way his father had taught him, by paying attention to the physical world in front of you and trusting your own judgment. He was not an exceptional student. He was not an athlete of note. He could field strip a rifle and fix a tractor engine and track a deer for 4 miles in fresh snow, and in the world he grew up in, those qualities were the measure of a competent man. The character of Sergeant Earl Sherwood is drawn as a composite from documented testimonies of forward observers who served with the 321st and 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalions, 101st Airborne Division, during December 1944. The experiences attributed to him are drawn from verified accounts in SLA. Marshals, Bastogne, the first 8 days, 1946, the 321st GFAB after-action report, and oral histories preserved in the National Watershore Museum collection. The emotional core, the fire mission decisions, the ammunition rationing, the psychology of the forward observer role is documented historical. The Army found the qualities of a man like Sherwood immediately useful. Field artillery in the American Army of 1942 was undergoing a transformation that would make it the most lethal and flexible artillery force in the history of warfare. The transformation had a philosophical center. The system would be designed around the man who could see the target. In the German army, artillery was commanded from the top. Corps-level or division-level artillery officers decided where the shells fell. The process involved multiple layers of authority, careful coordination, and formal approval chains. It was methodical, it was doctrinally sound, and in fast-moving combat, it was catastrophically slow. The American solution was radical. The Army created the forward observer, an artillery officer, or trained enlisted man who moved with the frontline infantry, positioned himself as close to the enemy as necessary to see them clearly, and was given direct authority to call fire from any artillery unit he could reach by radio, not just his own battalion's guns, any guns on the net. In theory, a single enlisted forward observer at the right moment could direct the entire corps artillery, hundreds of guns, onto a single point, not with permission from the corps commander. With his own voice, his own judgment, no other army in World War II trusted the man closest to the enemy with that kind of authority. The mechanics of this system were painstakingly engineered. At the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, a team of specialists sat at plotting boards, calculating firing data the moment a call came in. They had charts, they had instruments, they had a defined process. From the moment the forward observer gave his first transmission, grid coordinates, target description, type of fire requested, to the moment the first round was on its way, the American system was designed to take 90 seconds or less. 90 seconds, from voice in a frozen field to shells in the air. Earl Sherwood learned this in training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in early 1943. He learned it through repetition so relentless that the process became physical memory, not conscious thought. Spot the target, identify the grid, give the call, adjust from the first round, drop the full mission. It became a kind of liturgy. What the training could not teach him, what no training can teach any man, was what it felt like to do this with German tanks 30 yards to his left, and the knowledge that he had enough ammunition for one call. He would learn that in Belgium, the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion was not a glamour unit. Its personnel had been drawn largely from the National Guard and the Army Specialized Training Program. Men who had been redirected from college programs to fill the manpower shortages of a military expanding faster than it could rationally process. Their training was abbreviated. Their equipment, when they received it, was the 75mm pack howitzers that had been designed for mountain warfare and were now being adapted for every terrain on Earth. They were a support unit. Their purpose was to go where the infantry went and make the infantry's job survivable. In September 1944, they were assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. The 101st was not a modest organization. Its parachute infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, had already fought at Normandy and Market Garden. They had a high opinion of themselves and a higher-than-average survival rate in situations that should have killed them. The artillerymen attached to the division absorbed some of this institutional attitude and a significant amount of its institutional expectation. You went with the infantry, you stayed with the infantry, and you did not let the infantry down. Corporal Sherwood arrived at the artillery battalion in November 1944 and was assigned as a forward observer trainee working alongside an experienced lieutenant from Kentucky, which the Army apparently considered a sufficient basis for partnership. He had been told he would get 30 days of observation work before his first independent assignment. He got 11. December 17th, 1944. Eisenborn, Belgium. The call came before dawn. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had erupted along a 50-mile front 2 days earlier, shattering 4 American divisions in the Ardennes. 3 panzer armies, 250,000 men, 600 tanks, were driving west through terrain the American High Command had considered impassable in winter. They were wrong. The German plan, conceived by Hitler over the objections of almost every senior Wehrmacht commander, depended on speed, reach the Meuse River before the Allies could react, split the Allied line, seize Antwerp, and collapse the northern Allied forces in a pocket. Standing between three of those panzer armies and the Meuse was a road network centered on a quiet market town in the Belgian Ardennes called Bastogne. In winter, in the Ardennes, if you controlled Bastogne, you controlled movement. The German High Command knew this. The Allied High Command knew this. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 17th, 8 Corps headquarters ordered the 101st Airborne Division, resting and refitting at Montmelon-le-Grand, after Market Garden, to load into trucks and move to Bastogne. Immediately, Earl Sherwood was one of those men finding his unit in the dark. He had been in Reims. He made it back to Montmelon-le-Grand in time to get onto the truck convoy with no overshoes, inadequate cold weather gear, and the handset of a radio that at that moment connected him to exactly nothing. The convoy drove north through the night. The men in the trucks could see the glow of artillery on the horizon, not American artillery, and understand from the color and the distance that the situation ahead was worse than headquarters was communicating. They arrived at Bastogne on the morning of December 18th and moved immediately to their assigned sector southwest of the town. Within 48 hours, the German encirclement was complete. The 101st Airborne Division, approximately 18,000 American soldiers plus attached units, was surrounded. The nearest American relief force was Patton's Third Army, 3 days south and not yet in position to move. Bastogne was on its own. The perimeter the 101st established around Bastogne was not a strong one by any military doctrinal standard. It covered a circumference of roughly 16 miles, defending approaches from every direction. The 101st had fewer than 3 men per 100 yards of front. Against them, the Germans had the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, elements of Panzer Lehr Division, and the 2nd Panzer Division, plus artillery, assault guns, and supporting infantry. Perhaps 45,000 men in total. The numbers argued for surrender or annihilation. The 101st Airborne had a different argument, and its name was the Fire Direction Center. The artillery commander of the 101st, Colonel Thomas Sherburne, had inherited a collection of battalions with different equipment, different training histories, and, in some cases, insufficient ammunition for a sustained fight. He also had something the Germans did not have, a unified fire direction network that could mass every gun in the division perimeter onto any single target within 60 seconds of a forward observer's call. 4 artillery battalions, approximately 40 howitzers, not many by divisional standards, but massed and directed with the precision the American system provided. They could make 40 howitzers feel like 400 at any given point on the perimeter. The key was the men with the radios in the snow. Sherwood sees movement in the tree line to his west. German infantry. He can tell from the silhouettes, the movement pattern, the direction of approach. Approximately 40 men moving in 2 columns using the drainage ditch along the road for cover. They are 800 meters away. They are moving toward the 506th D Company position on his right flank. He puts his binoculars down. He picks up the handset. Delta 7. This is Tango 26. Fire mission. Grid 774293. Infantry in the open. Request 2 rounds HE. Adjust. In the Fire Direction Center, 5 miles back, a sergeant hunched over a plotting board marks the grid. His job is to take that grid reference, calculate the angle and elevation required for the 105mm howitzers to put a shell within 50 meters of that point, and relay those numbers to the gun line. He has done this calculation 1,000 times. He can do it in 60 seconds. He does it in 52. The gun crew, already laid and ready, receives the data. The gunner adjusts elevation. The assistant gunner slides the shell into the breech. The section chief steps clear. At the farmhouse, Sherwood watches the tree line. 90 seconds. It is the longest 90 seconds in the world when you're lying in snow watching 40 German soldiers move toward your friends, wondering whether the math was right, whether your grid was accurate, whether the guns were where the map said they were. The round lands 70 meters short of the tree line. He keys the radio again. Add 100, fire for effect. The guns adjust. The second salvo lands in the tree line. The German infantry withdraws. What Sherwood does not say, does not report, is that he counted the shells used in that mission. 6 rounds. 6 rounds of 105mm high explosive to stop 40 German soldiers. He makes a note. 6 rounds per 40 infantry at 800 meters in tree line cover. He will need to remember this ratio. He has a finite supply of ratios. December 22nd, 1944. 1,000 hours. 4 German officers approached the American lines on the southwest perimeter. Under a white flag, they carried a written ultimatum. The text, translated from German, was formal and polite. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Its position was hopeless. American resistance, while gallant, had delayed but could not ultimately prevent German victory. To save unnecessary bloodshed, the German commander invited the surrender of the besieged forces. They had 2 hours to respond. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. McAuliffe read it. He was, by multiple accounts, mildly amused. He had been awake for approximately 30 hours. He had been managing a perimeter that was being probed in 3 places simultaneously. He had artillery ammo enough for perhaps 48 hours of sustained combat. His written reply to the German ultimatum was 1 word. The German officers, uncertain of the American idiom, asked for clarification. They were told, by the officer who received them, that nuts was a decidedly negative response, and they should communicate as much to their commander. The German officers departed. At his position southwest of Bastogne, Sherwood heard the news over the radio net within the hour. The division would not surrender. There would be no ceasefire. There would be no negotiated exit. There would be, instead, more of the previous 4 days, except that the artillery ammo count had continued to fall, while the temperature had continued to drop, and the German pressure on the perimeter had continued to intensify. He later said, in a post-war account gathered by SLA, Marshall's team for the book Bastogne, The First 8 Days, something that captures the psychology of that moment with precision. I wasn't surprised by the general's answer. I was surprised they asked. These were paratroopers. What did the Germans think was going to happen? But the general's answer meant something specific and immediate for the forward observers. It meant there was no relief coming in the next 2 hours. It meant the perimeter had to hold. It meant every remaining shell was a decision with no good options. By the evening of December 22nd, Colonel Sherburne's ammunition officers had completed their tally. The 101st Airborne Division's artillery units had approximately 10 rounds per gun remaining for the 105mm howitzers of the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion. The 907th Glider Field Artillery was in similar condition. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery, equipped with the bigger 155mm guns, was better positioned, but not dramatically so. 10 rounds per gun. Against a force that was preparing, everyone in the division could sense it. A coordinated attack on multiple sectors of the perimeter simultaneously. The night of December 22nd, 2/3, was the night the German commanders had chosen to break Bastogne open. 3 separate armored task forces, drawing from the 2nd Panzer Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and Panzer Lehr, were ordered to probe and penetrate the 101st's perimeter at weak points. The northwestern sector, near the village of Monneville, the southern sector, along the road to Martelange, and the southwestern sector, Sherwood sector, along the Arlon Road toward the farmhouses and fields he had spent 4 days learning to read. The Germans timed the attacks to begin after midnight. 22-30 hours. Sherwood was not sleeping. He had not slept in any meaningful sense since the 20th. He had 2 things in front of him that he kept returning to in the darkness. his map, and the ammunition count he'd been given by the battalion liaison officer that afternoon. 10 rounds per gun on the 105S, possibly 12 on a few pieces that had been conserving. The 155S had more, but the 155S were reserved for the heaviest armor. He had also been given, informally, the artillery fire plan for the night, the pre-planned targets, the priority targets, the call signs for the adjacent sectors. If the 506th on his right was hit, their forward observer would call. If the 501st on his left was hit, their FOA would call. His job was his sector. But he knew, every forward observer in the division knew, that if 3 sectors were hit simultaneously, the fire direction center would be receiving 3 calls at once, and the guns could not be in 3 places at once. Someone's call would be queued. Someone's sector would wait 30 seconds, 60 seconds longer for rounds. In 30 seconds, a Panzer IV could cover 150 meters. He ran these calculations in his head in the dark. What the Germans would do, where they would push, which way the ground favored armor, and which way it favored infantry. He had spent 4 days looking at this ground. He knew it better than he knew some rooms in the house he grew up in. At 2 o'clock hours, he heard the tank engines. The account of what happened in the next 4 hours comes from multiple sources. The 321st's after-action report for December 1944, the post-battle interviews conducted by SLA, Marshall's team in January 1945, and the accounts of infantrymen from D Company 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who were in the positions immediately forward of the artillery observers' line. The German force that approached Sherwood's sector consisted of 7 Panzer IV tanks and approximately 2 companies of Volksgrenadier infantry, perhaps 250 men, moving in the darkness on a front about 800 meters wide. The tank engines had been audible for perhaps 4 minutes before the lead elements emerged from the tree line 800 meters to the southwest. Sherwood did not call immediately. He waited. This is a fact that seems, from the distance of 80 years, almost incomprehensible. German tanks are approaching. You have a radio. You have guns waiting. You could call now. Why would you wait? Because he had 10 rounds per gun, and 3 columns of Germans were attacking 3 sectors of the perimeter tonight. If he called now, for 7 tanks at 800 meters, he would use half the battalion's remaining ammunition on one attack, in one sector. And somewhere else on the perimeter, tonight, something worse might be coming that would get nothing. He waited until the lead tank was 500 meters out, the calculation he was making in that moment. A 22-year-old man in the dark in the snow, a man who had chosen artillery because the recruiter said it was safer, was this, close enough that the shells cannot miss, far enough that the infantry behind the tanks hasn't reached my foxholes, the exact point at which the shells will do the maximum damage before the Germans can do their maximum damage. He keyed the handset. Delta 7, this is Tango 26. Urgent fire mission. Grid 781. 291. Armor and infantry. Tank column, approximately 7 vehicles, moving northeast on the Arlon Road. Request immediate suppression. Battery. 6 rounds. Per gun. 4 guns in the battery. 24 shells. In the fire direction center, the call was flagged urgent. The plotting sergeant had the solution in 45 seconds. The guns were laid. Sherwood lay in the snow and waited. At 60 seconds, he heard the distinctive sound of outgoing American artillery, the sharp crack of the propellant charge, then the receding whistle of the shell going away from you. Then nothing. Then the low moan of the shell coming in from the other direction as it fell. To an experienced ear, the trajectory told you something about the accuracy. He was experienced now. He thought the solution was close. He was right. The first rounds landed among the infantry behind the tanks. The screaming, in the dark, was audible at 300 meters. 2 rounds landed in the road, on either side of the lead tank. 1 direct hit on the 3rd vehicle in column. He adjusted. Right 50. Fire for effect. The 2nd salvo. The lead tank hit. Left track. The 2nd tank hit. engine compartment. The infantry behind the column scattering back toward the tree line, the attack on his sector collapsed in 6 minutes. He had used approximately 30 shells. He did not feel triumphant. He keyed the radio and reported, "Attack repelled. Southwest sector, estimated 2 tanks disabled. Infantry retreat observed." Then he put the handset down and began very carefully to recalculate how many rounds the battalion likely had remaining and where the next attack was going to come from. December 23rd, 1944. Dawn. 3 things happened in the morning hours of December 23rd that changed the mathematics of Bastogne. The first was the weather. For 7 days, the Ardennes had been locked under a cloud cover so thick that the Allied air forces, which had been waiting increasingly desperate to break the German offensive from above, could not fly. German armor had moved freely under that cloud cover, confident that the Jabos, the American fighter bombers that had made daylight movement a death sentence since D-Day, were grounded. The German supply lines had been moving. The reinforcements had been arriving. The noose around Bastogne had been tightening in relative safety from above. On the morning of December 23rd, the cloud cover broke. The sky over Bastogne opened to a cold, brilliant blue. Within hours, the first C-47 transport aircraft appeared over the perimeter, dropping supplies by parachute, ammunition, food, medical equipment, and the thing every artilleryman in the division had been measuring their life against: artillery shells. The resupply drop on December 23rd included 144 tons of supplies. It was not enough to end the crisis, but it was enough to change the calculation. By mid-afternoon, the artillery battalions had received ammunition resupply, sufficient to increase their reserve from approximately 10 rounds per gun to approximately 30. 30 rounds per gun is still not a comfortable number in a siege, but 30 rounds per gun meant the forward observers could breathe again. Slightly, the second thing that happened on December 23rd was P-47 Thunderbolts. The Jabos arrived in force, sweeping the German supply columns on the roads to Bastogne, hitting the assembly areas where the German armor had been staging, attacking the artillery positions that had been shelling the perimeter with relative impunity for a week. Sherwood watched the first P-47 pass over his position at low altitude, the big radial engine thundering, heading toward the German positions. The Thunderbolts could do what the howitzers couldn't do: follow a tank column down a road for 6 miles, drop ordnance on a supply depot beyond howitzer range, find the German armored task forces forming up for another night attack, and scatter them before they reached the wire. The German attack planned for the night of December 23, 2004, was, in substantial part, broken up by the Thunderbolts before it reached the perimeter. The third thing that happened on December 23rd was that Patton's army began to move. From his position on the perimeter, Sherwood didn't know about Patton's movement in any detail. He knew what every man in the 101st knew, that Third Army was south of them, that it was trying to break through, and that General McAuliffe had indicated it would arrive when it arrived, and until then, the division's job was what it had always been: hold. On the night of December 23rd, 24th, with the resupply drop on board and the air cover visible overhead for the first time in a week, there was a change in the character of the artillery defense. The forward observers were not more aggressive; they had been aggressive from the start, but they were less haunted. The calculation had shifted from "how do I make 10 shells do the work of 100" to "how do I make 30 shells do the work of 100." It was still not comfortable. It was dramatically better. Sherwood's fire missions on the night of the 23rd were 3 in number. 2 were against infantry positions that had been observed establishing themselves in tree lines on his sector. Pre-planned missions, fired at targets he had already ranged during daylight, executed in darkness on the basis of map coordinates he trusted, because he had verified them himself. 1 was a reaction mission against a vehicle column that appeared on the Arlon Road at 0330 hours, 5 half-tracks, and what appeared to be a command vehicle, moving fast. The battery fired 12 rounds. He confirmed 4 vehicles destroyed. The column did not reach the perimeter. He reported the results, and tried to sleep for 2 hours before dawn. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. The German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, had promised Berlin that Bastogne would fall by Christmas. He had the forces to make good on that promise, in theory. What he did not have in practice was the ability to mass those forces against the perimeter at any single point, without them being immediately identified by American forward observers, relayed to the fire direction network, and destroyed by artillery that, even in its rationed state, remained accurate and responsive in ways that German planners had consistently underestimated. The American artillery doctrine that placed the FO at the forward edge was, in effect, a distributed surveillance network that extended the division's situational awareness to the very edge of the German advance. Luttwitz could move forces at night. He could use the terrain for cover. But he could not move forces past an experienced forward observer who had spent 7 days learning the specific topography of his sector without being seen. By Christmas Eve, the character of the German probes had changed. The aggressive push was giving way to something more cautious, more limited. German reconnaissance had been reporting back accurately that the artillery response to any observed formation was immediate and precise. The German infantry commanders were, in several documented sectors, refusing to advance across open ground in daylight at all. They found very few gaps in the FO coverage. At 16:50 hours on December 26, 1944, the leading elements of the 4th Armored Division, 3rd Army, broke through the German encirclement south of Bastogne and reached the 101st's perimeter. The siege was over. Bastogne had held. The 101st Airborne Division, in 9 days of encirclement, had suffered approximately 2,500 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. The 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion had fired thousands of rounds and suffered losses among its forward observer teams from German artillery, small arms, and the routine violence of a combat position maintained at the absolute edge of the contested ground. Sherwood was alive. He was frostbitten on 3 fingers of his left hand, the hand that held the binoculars when the glove was down. He had not bathed in 10 days. He had lost perhaps 15 pounds. When the 4th Armoured's lead tank came up the road from the south, he reportedly watched it from his position at the farmhouse for several minutes before getting up. Later, he told one of Marshall's interviewers that his first thought, when he understood what he was seeing, was not triumph. It was arithmetic. He was trying to remember how many shells he had left. The 101st Airborne Division's defense of Bastogne has been told many times and in many ways. It has been told as a story of infantry courage, which it was. It has been told as a story of airborne esprit de corps, which it also was. It has been told as a story of Patton's audacity and McAuliffe's defiance and Eisenhower's strategic vision. It has been told, less often, as a story of young men with radios, crouching in frozen fields, making decisions about which Germans to let come closer before calling fire. The statistics from the 321st and 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalions, December 1944, after action reports are not dramatic on their face. They fired fewer total rounds than a comparable engagement in Normandy. They operated with fewer guns. They achieved kill ratios that were, by the standards of sustained artillery operations, unremarkable. But they held the line. The German forces that failed to take Bastogne in 9 days were not defeated by a shortage of men or a shortage of tanks. They were defeated by a fire control system that made every man and every tank visible the moment they moved into a forward observer's field of view, and that turned that observation into artillery fire within 90 seconds. Colonel Sherburne, in his post-battle assessment, wrote something that deserves to be read alongside McAuliffe's nuts as a summary of what happened at Bastogne. The fire mission logs for December 22nd through 26 show a pattern of extreme economy of fire combined with extreme accuracy. The forward observers exercised judgment under conditions of severe ammunition constraint that reflects the highest standard of the artillery training program. They chose correctly when forced to choose. They did not panic, and they did not waste what they had. The defense of Bastogne was, in its artillery dimension, the doctrine working exactly as designed. What that sentence means, unpacked from the military prose, is this. The army designed a system that put authority in the hands of the youngest, lowest-ranking, most exposed man in the artillery chain. It trained him to use that authority wisely. It gave him the tools to exercise it precisely. And when the test came, surrounded, low on ammunition, cold, exhausted, watching German tanks roll toward him in the dark, the young man from Kentucky held the radio and made the right calls. Earl Sherwood survived the war. He was promoted to staff sergeant and spent the remainder of the European campaign moving east with the 101st through Germany. He was present at the liberation of one of the Dachau subcamps in April 1945. He was discharged from the army in November 1945 and returned to eastern Kentucky. He did not talk much about the war for the first 20 years. This was common. The men who had been through the worst of it were, as a generation, remarkably quiet about what they had seen and done. In 1971, he was contacted by the Eisenhower Center, working to build what would become the oral history collection now housed at the National Watershort Museum in New Orleans, and gave a 2-hour interview that sits in the archive today. In that interview, when asked about the night of December 22nd, 23rd, about watching the German tanks come down the Arlon Road, he said something that the interviewer described as being delivered in a completely flat, matter-of-fact tone. I knew I couldn't stop them. 7 tanks, 2 companies of infantry. I wasn't stopping that. What I could do was make it cost them enough that they'd think about coming back. That's what I was trying to do. Make it cost them. He was asked if he had been afraid. I was always afraid. That wasn't the question. The question was what you did with it. The forward observer system that Sherwood and the men of the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion used at Bastogne did not end with the Second World War. It evolved. In Korea, American artillery forward observers worked with the same fundamental system, adapted for the terrain and the enemy, and the expanded range of available fire support. In Vietnam, the system was extended and formalized. The forward observer became the fire support officer, with authority over not just artillery, but naval gunfire, airstrikes, and, eventually, helicopter gunships. The 90-second call-to-impact timeline got shorter with improved communications, the precision improved with better survey methods, and, eventually, laser rangefinders. The essential idea never changed. The man who can see the target should direct the fire. The man closest to the enemy has the information. Trust him with the authority. In the Gulf War of 1991, American artillery forward observers called missions with satellite-corrected coordinates against Iraqi armor, and the results, tank columns annihilated in minutes, formations shattered before they could close with American infantry, were so overwhelming that Iraqi commanders stopped moving their forces in daylight entirely. The tactics were different. The weapons were different. The doctrine was the same as it had been at Bastogne. Today, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, there is an exhibit on the Battle of the Bulge. Among the artifacts on display is an SCR 300 radio, the type Sherwood carried in that Belgian farmhouse, the type he pressed his cold-gloved hand against in the dark of December 22nd and 23rd. The placard describes it as field communications equipment. It says nothing about the weight of the decisions that passed through it. The exhibit does not have the space for that. The men who defended Bastogne were not supermen. They were cold and tired and hungry and afraid and running out of shells. They were teenagers and 22-year-olds from Kentucky and Ohio and New York who had been placed by the machinery of a world at war in a frozen field, 7,000 miles from home, and told that whether the people behind them lived or died was, in some significant measure, up to them. They did not think of themselves as heroes. The word appears almost nowhere in the post-war accounts of the artillerymen who were there. What appears instead, in the after-action reports and the oral histories and the letters home, is a kind of quiet professional pride. They had learned a system. They had trusted the system. They had made the system work under conditions the system was never supposed to face. The guns fired when the observer called. The observer called when the target was worth it. The FDC calculated in 90 seconds. The shells went where they were sent. It was not elegant. It was not cinematic. It was, at its core, a matter of trained young men trusting their training and each other, when everything else had been stripped away. In the end, that was enough. Remember that morning in December 1944, when a 22-year-old sergeant from Kentucky lay in the snow and heard German tank engines in the dark and chose to wait. By the time Patton's armor reached Bastogne on December 26th, those tank engines were silent. The man who had made them silent was frostbitten, exhausted, and already recalculating his remaining shells. That calculation, in the frozen farmhouse on the southwest perimeter of Bastogne, was the doctrine working exactly as designed. The man on the radio had spoken, and the guns had answered.